Hello, everybody. What is up? Welcome back to the Climate of Sport podcast with me, Claire Poole. I hope you're having a brilliant week. It's been a week with a lot of sport since we last spoke. European Champions League efforts going on. Atletico Madrid reaching the semi-finals for the first time in 9 years. Congrats to them. Rory McIlroy taking the Masters in Augusta. NBA playing and postseason battles are underway. There's heaps going on. Personally, I was out at the Sport and Sustainability Conference at the University of Bern, presenting about sport communications on climate. Hot takes from that are on LinkedIn, so the link for that is in the show notes. But the big points I really wanted to land there was to speak to the audience about telling more human and relatable stories. So often, sustainability content in sport seems to be based around communications like X number of tons have been saved in carbon emissions or X tons have been diverted in waste, which are incredible achievements and not to be sniffed at all. But while we know data is absolutely critical, we also know from a communications perspective that it's not what moves people. We need to understand our audience, we need to know what moves them. And that, of course, changes depending on who you're chatting to. So for sure, I cannot underline strongly enough that it's not about ignoring that verifiable data, making sure we have measurable outcomes, but it's about having that in our pocket, but remembering that human beings don't make decisions based on data. How information is presented, cognitive shortcuts, value judgment, gut feelings, cultural or ethical values, they all play a part in decisions that people who are watching sport, engaging in sport, etc., are going to make. So we need to be genuinely engaging, we need to be real, and we need to connect in a way that people care about. The day I wrote about that on LinkedIn and put it out, Christiana Figueres shared a post on the same platform about a conversation she had had with The Guardian that illustrated this very point. She said, "We've talked about sea level rise in centimetres and projections for decades. That framing has failed us. Rising sea levels are damaging bodies, contaminating food, destroying medicines that coastal communities have relied upon for centuries. 60% of Pacific health infrastructure sites are within 500 metres of the coastline. This is a health crisis." This really outlined the point and framed, from one of the godmothers of the climate movement, Christiana Figueres, obviously the powerhouse at UN Climate, who was in charge when the Paris Agreement was signed, saying something very similar to what we're talking about here. In sport, the stories don't always have to be about what we are going to lose. I know that doesn't work for some people. They can be, of course, about the opportunities of what's possible if we take action. But the takeaway is essentially the same. We need to frame the information through a lens of what people care about. And one thing we know for sure is that people really care about sport. So the opportunity for us, if we shift and we become the translator of that information, is absolutely huge. Right, on to the climate hat trick for this week. 3 stories that are happening in the world of sport, navigated to you through the lens of climate as well, with a few insights thrown in for good measure. First story is energy crisis hits cricket for 6 in Bangladesh and Pakistan. In Bangladesh, energy-saving measures have forced the Bangladesh Cricket Board to rethink the timing of their international cricket games, with men's one-day internationals now starting at 11 a.m. in the morning in order to finish before sunset and avoid the need for floodlights. Women's T20 internationals have been similarly adjusted, marking a rare instance in our sport calendar where broadcast-friendly evening fixtures have been displaced because of national energy constraints. This isn't about scheduling, it's about scarcity. With Bangladesh relying on imports for roughly 90% of its energy needs, particularly in liquefied natural gas and oil, the country is now acutely exposed to oil disruption from conflict in the Middle East, which is triggering nationwide rationing and austerity. Cricket, therefore, sits downstream of this infrastructure reality. Floodlit matches, a standard symbol of modern broadcast sport, carry a direct energy cost that now competes with wider national priorities. Adjusting start times to daylight hours effectively removes that demand from the system, reducing the pressure on an already constrained grid. This situation highlights how sport can be shaped by the limits of energy systems rather than the logic of broadcasting or spectator convenience. And this is not an isolated pace globally. In Pakistan, the Pakistan Super League, which runs from the 26th of March to the 3rd of May, has cut its hosting venues from 6 to 2, with all stage matches now happening in Lahore and Karachi. The league has fans to watch its biggest cricket tournaments at home rather than attend matches, as Pakistan scrambles to conserve fuel amid the spiraling oil and gas shortages triggered again by the US-Israeli war against Iran. The Pakistan Cricket Board said an average of 30,000 spectators and support staff travelling every day for more than a month, quote, would place significant strain on energy resources, close quote. What makes the Bangladesh, first of all, example significant, so the fact that the daytime matches are happening instead, is the normalisation of that adjustment at an international level. Rather than isolated postponements or cancellations, entire series are now being scheduled around energy constraints as standard practice. This raises the broader question about how sport will continue to operate in an era of energy transition and volatility. Stadium lighting, broadcaster infrastructure, climate control, and digital production all depend on stable, high-capacity electricity systems. When those systems are under strain, like we're seeing now, sport becomes one of the many sectors required to adapt. Renewable energy and decentralized grid systems can be framed in sport as a sustainability add-on or a long-term environmental commitment or a nice to have. But cases like Bangladesh and Pakistan point to a more immediate function, and that function is resilience. The ability to maintain cultural and civic life, including international sport, increasingly depends on energy systems that are not only lower carbon, but are stable under pressure. Again, cricket in Bangladesh is simply reflecting that reality. Match times now follow the constraints of the grid, not the demand of global broadcast schedules. Story 2, Cabo Verde's World Cup kit tells a bigger story than football. Cabo Verde's World Cup dream has arrived. Its kits were unveiled this week, and it marks the first appearance on football's biggest stage, the FIFA Men's World Cup 2026, for one of the smallest nations to compete in the tournament's history. But this is more than a kit drop. The design carries a deeper meaning tied to the identity of the islands it represents. A triangular graphic wrapped in both the home and away shirts is inspired by the interconnecting flight paths linking all 10 islands of the West African archipelago. On the surface, this is a celebration of connection and unity. There is perhaps another subtext too. Tourism is a primary driver of Cabo Verde's economy, contributing between 20 and 25% of its global domestic profit, its GDP, and driving roughly 10% of formal employment. This theme highlights the archipelago's connectivity and is often associated in tourism, promoting the island hopping experience for visitors. Of course, I see another angle too. This expanded World Cup spread across the US, Mexico, and Canada is going to drive significantly more air travel than previous tournaments, and with it, a sharp rise in carbon emissions. Against this backdrop, a kit designed for a place that's already feeling the impact of climate change, built on flight paths, seems quietly ironic. Cabo Verde sits on the front lines of climate change. The islands are highly vulnerable to severe drought, water scarcity, coastal erosion, and that threatens their economy and their food security. Key impacts include a 20% projected reduction in rainfall, increased floods, damage to tourism from rising sea levels, and significant threats to agriculture productivity, making environmental resilience a daily reality rather than a distant concern. There's another layer to this kit drop too, pun intended. The culture of football kits themselves. 48 teams have dropped home and away kits, so 96 in total, and The Athletic announced that Cabo Verde are expected to release a third kit soon. Now, fans of Cabo Verde are likely to hang on to these shirts forever. Such are their significance of being represented on a world stage for a nation and diaspora connected by culture, rhythm, and shared identity, which is the theme of the kit. But it's another reminder of football's relentless cycle of new season, new kit that rapidly fuels rapid consumption and growing waste. It's an issue that sparked industry-wide reflection, with initiatives like the Sustainable Sports Apparel Charter pushing to extend product life cycles and reduce environmental impact. As fans rush globally to buy the new shirts, the irony lingers. A kit for Cabo Verde that is inspired by flight paths, worn on a stage that will generate probably unprecedented travel emissions compared to previous mega sport eventing tournaments, representing a nation that is already living with the consequences of climate change. Football is absolutely brilliant at telling stories, but I guess the question here is whether it's ready to confront the ones it's a part of. Story 3. Did the Paris Marathon really lose the plot last weekend? Last weekend, the 2026 Paris Marathon took place without traditional water stations that we've come to expect, with single-use cups and bottles that runners grab really quickly, swig a bit out of, and then throw away as they run to get their record time or PB. An article entitled, quote, "Paris Marathon lost the plot with its no water cup policy," close quote, written by Alex Zaire, caught my attention around this. Alex's thesis in this article was that the Paris Marathon's decision to remove water cups from its course to reduce its carbon footprint was misguided. In an effort to be more sustainable this year, the race required runners to carry their own water containers, which they could fill at volunteer-run dispensers along the course. He posited that requiring runners to carry their own water will cause negative issues that include: runners might decide not to compete in the marathon because of carrying water or refilling their cups jeopardizing their target time. People could be thrown single-use bottles by supporters waiting for them at key points on the sidelines, which could cause hazards and then litter anyway. And some may choose not to carry hydration, and on a super hot day, the marathon could have taken place during may cause medical issues. He also did a back of the cigarette packet calculation that by using this system, we relieve the atmosphere of about 15 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. In his view, about the same as cancelling a 75 passenger return flight from London to Paris. Commentators had plenty to say on this article. Former elite marathon runner and best-selling author Tina Muir landed a few points quite quickly that had been missed from the piece. Firstly, this decision to not have water cups at the Paris Marathon did not come from the marathon organisers, but from the city of Paris itself. It was a requirement, not a choice, prompted by a citywide ban 2 years ago on single-use plastics at all Parisian races. 2, from a safety perspective, carrying your own water bottle, she said, through a bottle or a vest, which doesn't require holding anything at all, can actually be better for safety, and runners can sip their water throughout the race rather than waiting for key moments. Darren Evans, who's the founder of Green Runners, also queried, how do runners hydrate when they're training? He asked. Why should road runners be any different to trail runners? Trail runners have to carry their own hydration, and some of the best in the world are chasing records and PBs just like road runners, he said. People weren't all in favour of this. Ruben de Souza said, my take is for the outrageous entry price of a marathon, they can certainly afford some carbon offset on their own instead of degrading the racing experience. Some people had commented directly on the article as well, people generally who had been involved with actually taking part in the Paris Marathon. Lisa said, I just did the Paris Marathon. Access to water wasn't a problem for me. There was always a water spout available, even in the busiest areas. Peter said, in theory, the idea is laudable, but practically, I think it is more performative. Bill said, my wife ran Paris on Sunday. She's a serious runner, serious enough to have won her age group. She had misgivings about the no cup policy, but said it actually worked out brilliantly. What you didn't mention, he says, obviously directing this comment towards the article author, was that each runner was provided with a small collapsible reusable cup as part of their race packet. My wife was pleasantly surprised how much easier it was to get water. There are a number of comments that cover different angles that we've referenced here, and there are some additional points as well. Firstly, in regard to what Alex said about the fact that if this is putting off people reaching a personal best or a race time, they might decide not to compete in a marathon. It probably is an interesting point to point out, not for Paris, but for London, a record-breaking 1.13 million people entered the public ballot for this year's London Marathon for, I think, around 55 or 60,000 places. So there doesn't seem to be a shortage of people who want to run. And also another element I want to flag is this optics versus impact. Even if the absolute emissions reduction from removing these cups is modest, these highly visible changes at mass events can normalise new behaviours far beyond the race itself. And that's often what we're talking about when it comes to engaging people around these topics through sport. Often it is symbolic. It isn't necessarily always going to have the biggest reduction in carbon emissions than other areas, but it's somewhere that we can take action and point to. So what one respondent to the article called performative, these changes can get dismissed, but in public-facing events, symbolism is part of how norms evolve. We could flag, for example, banning plastic bags or charging for them. These small actions that people are up in arms about initially then become normalised very quickly. We had this conversation on the pod a few weeks ago of F1 changing the way its racing takes place, and I highlighted a number of different changes that have happened historically that had people in uproar at the time that have now become part of the landscape of racing. The reaction to Paris Marathon's no-cut policy shows how quickly a practical change also gets viewed as a binary, good for the planet versus bad for runners. But the evidence so far suggests it's neither that simple nor honestly that dramatic. From reading reactions, the real tension seems to not be about actually cups versus no cups, but maybe about a shift in responsibility. Runners, in some cases, now feel some kind of burden about carrying their own water or cup when they are paying to be part of a marathon race, different to perhaps other training that they take part in. Hydration has traditionally been something that races provide part and parcel without participants having to think about it. They are actually still doing that. They're providing, in the Paris Marathon's case, both the receptacles that you can carry and also the water stations for you to access. But there is a shift, as thin as maybe paper, that hydration is now perhaps moved towards facilitation rather than entire, completely thoughtless, part and parcel provision. So if runners perceive the changes as degrading their experience or unfairly shifting burden, the behavioural signal that we're looking to achieve could backfire in some cases, creating a resistance rather than adoption. However, from what we've seen in terms of the conversations online, that resistance doesn't actually seem to be there at scale. On the ground, what we've heard from reading some of these comments is that many runners report the system worked better than expected, even improving flow at some of those aid stations. And that then weakens the claim that the policy fundamentally breaks the race experience. Mass participation events like marathons are incredible social proof engines. What feels unusual today, self-carried hydration in road races, can become standard very quickly and much faster through sport than through policy alone. I guess the big credibility test is going to be about whether this behaviour sticks. The real measure perhaps isn't only an isolated race day execution, but whether runners keep using sustainable and reusable hydration options, and if we see these policies extending elsewhere. So we'll keep an eye out for that. The three stories on today's Climate Hat-Trick are: energy crisis hits cricket for six in Bangladesh and Pakistan. Cabo Verde's World Cup kit tells a bigger story than football. And did Paris Marathon really lose the plot? That's it from us this week. A couple of heads up. We'll be back next week with our regular podcast, but also we are dropping a bumper bonus episode of the podcast next week on Wednesday, April 22nd for Earth Day. That is going to be a FIFA Men's World Cup 2026 deep dive special, from climate commitments to actions, extreme weather impacts, fan engagement, host city, community and legacy activity, sponsorship and more. I am joined by 10 expert guests for this definitive guide you will not want to miss. So I look forward to chatting to you next week, and have a great week. That's it from us.